Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Andrew Davis, and you're watching Conversations in Pop Culture. And yes, I am scandalous like an Ashley. And I do want to remind everybody that this episode is brought to you by Pocket Jack Comics, which is coming to a local comic store near you. And you can right now check out preview copies of the sexy comics Guinevere and the Divine Factory and Palace of the Golden Princess at pocketjackcomics.com. And if you actually sign up for their email list, you'll get a free preview PDF of the book so you can actually see them what they look like. And you should look for some hot, sexy variants coming in March in your local comic shop. But enough about that because I have with me comic creator John Lamont. So welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
I am very excited because obviously Preston has spoken about you, and Preston's been on the show. Obviously, Preston's a sponsor of the show, and I very much appreciate everything Preston has done for me. And I know that Preston has helped you with your book, and you are fully funded with your latest Kickstarter, Spirit of the Dragon issue 4. And a lot's going on with that story. But before we dive too deep into that and maybe a little bit of Kickstarter, I am curious, what is the basic premise of this book for those who are hearing about it for the first time?
Basic premise is about a orphan teenager who is recruited by United States Army intelligence to investigate a secret Nazi weapon facility in the basement of a high school.
Yeah, no, see, this is why I like this book, because what I really enjoy about your book, and obviously I've looked at a bunch of Kickstarters, I've paid attention to it, is that we have this premise of a character going into a high school and obviously dealing with high school drama, dealing with military drama, figuring out why weapons there, and then also kind of figuring out what's going on here. And it's so interesting that you have combined a bunch of things that should not be combined together into it, and you get a little bit of everything in your comic.
Yeah, I was kind of going more for a action spy thriller thing, and the other kind of pieces just kind of fit together with the story that I wanted to tell. Um, it is kind of an off the wall concept, and I kind of like that stuff. So yeah, it's a fun little story. People seem to enjoy it.
So to even go further into it, because obviously there is that spy sort of mystery of why that weapon is there being developed. There is sort of a cat and mouse element to it as well, and it's very much an intelligence game in certain aspects. And I like the fact though that there is a bunch of sexiness to this too, which is nice. And that's what I like about it in many ways, as well as that we're not just getting a noir spy thriller, we're kind of getting, a 21st century book here. And I kind of equated to, Argo and or Agent Argyle to some degree. It kind of gives off that vibe. And I just saw that movie and I'm looking at your book and I'm like, man, this is kind of in that vein a little bit.
Awesome.
So obviously, I mean, there's that in there, and I don't want to ruin too much because obviously, if I start diving into your book, I'm going to start ruining stuff. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff behind your book, where and I kind of tip my hat off a little bit, but what I really find interesting is that I don't feel like you're shoving down a harem fantasy down my throat, even though it's in a high school where it's got some military elements to it, but there also is that sexiness to it. And what is that like to figure out the balance? Because one of my biggest pet peeves in comics right now is that it's almost just TNA completely, and there's no substance, there's no story. And I felt that you have a nice balance where we get some of that in there, but we also have a pretty solid story in what you're doing and what you're telling, but it's fun. And I don't know if that makes any sense because I think you're a good example of how to do it correctly.
Um, yeah, well, I mean, to avoid the harem aspect, there really are no male characters in the story. There's a few side characters, but in a harem anime or manga, usually the main character is a male who's surrounded by all these gorgeous women that are in love with him, and he can't decide which one he wants to be or be with rather. Whereas this, the focus of the story is really on the personal journey of our protagonist, Julia. She's trying to navigate a world, um, it's that is kind of unfriendly to her, while at the same time trying to uncover secrets as to, you know, why her father was killed. And then of course we have the villains who, um even though, yes, it's a Nazi weapon factory in the basement of a high school, the main characters really aren't Nazis, and they don't really even like Nazis, but they're kind of like, they've made a deal with the devil and now they're kind of stuck with it. So I tried to lean into that to make it more of an interesting character dynamic from the villain side as well. Um, and that, and then of course it's, for any good story conflict-based story, you need to have the primary objectives of your main characters be in conflict with each other, and that's kind of where you come up with good conflict from. So that's kind of where I was going with that, where I didn't want it to simply be all about, ideologies, but focus more on the journey and the objectives of each character and what it is that they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, because I think, and this even goes further, and it's kind of, I'm going to semi-repeat what you just said, but also I think add to it is that I think a lot of writers also don't understand their characters sometimes, and they don't understand necessarily, hey, my character needs to go through an evolution arc. Because I read a lot of comics, and then by issue three, I'm like, this character is exhausted. And from what I've seen in the sample pages and a bunch of other stuff, I feel like these characters are evolving, and this main character is not only semi reliving high school, but also navigating a very complicated social circle, military circle. People know a bunch of other things going on, and we get an evolution kind of with this. And I think you have a battle plan. I think you actually, for lack of a better word, have a Bible for all your characters. And I think it's a real problem where I just feel like in comics, people don't know how to tell good stories anymore for the most part. And it's a real deficit. And I don't know how you feel, but I feel like you kind of have a grasp of, hey, we need to be here in issue four. We need to be here by issue six. By issue eight, we need to be over here. And then by issue 12, we need to be on the other side of the world. And you kind of have an idea how to get there.
Yeah, I had the main outline of the story already conceived, beginning, middle, and end before I even started. Before I even hired my artist, I knew exactly where I wanted to go with this story. Um, I really sometimes in long form stories, comics, TV shows, um, you get in the projects get a little bigger than what. Uh, Put it another way, sometimes stories go wander aimlessly in search of a plot. That's the term that I use for it. Where it's like they have characters and they have a deadline where we have to get this issue or this episode shot, but we don't know what we want to do with anybody, so just make something up. And I really wanted to make sure that before I started this process, that I knew exactly where I was going. So, yeah, that if it feels that way, that's intentional because I had pretty much planned that from the beginning.
So to even jump off of that and actually even go further into the behind the scenes stuff, I also feel, and feel free to challenge me on this, is that since you have an idea of where you're going and you're not aimlessly wondering or shooting in the dark for what's going to work, that also probably helps in you developing and building out a Kickstarter page and what you're going to do for variants and a bunch of other things that play into this, who you're going to hire for a variant cover, who you're going to use, if you're going to do anything special for the book. Because once you have an idea saying, cool, in issue three, we got this new villain, maybe she should have a variant cover. Because I feel like that's a really complicated and missing part right now in Kickstarters is that, to me, I think there's a formula in building a Kickstarter and building a successful campaign and not just getting funded, but doing double your goal or triple your goal or doing a five-figure campaign. And if you understand your story and what's going on in that issue, I feel you can match it. And so to me, that's what I really like about your campaigns. I looked at the first four and I'm like, this guy actually has an understanding of how to utilize Kickstarter and sell comics on Kickstarter.
Yeah, that's I yeah, I hmm, hmm, don't really know what to add to that.
Because
Um,
it's like a
I
formula.
do kind of agree, like when it comes to introducing a new character, because I am actually um in the middle of that. Not all of say sort of variant covers. Like the the funny thing is the variant cover that is blowing up my current Kickstarter is actually has no bearing on what happens in the story. It was really just something from multiple conversations with people at comic conventions.
Which cover is it? Because I think I could show it.
Yeah, it's the one on the main page of the Kickstarter, the whiskey paint cover.
Is it the one where she's spanking?
Yeah, yes,
Oh yeah, this one.
yeah, that never actually happens in the story.
Oh,
That cover was based on an idea that I got after having a few conversations with different people um, at comic conventions, and I thought, that sounds like it would be an interesting idea. And I honestly did not expect it, which is the one thing I will say. Like the covers that do really well for me are the ones I least expected. Um, like Spirit of the Dragon 3, I was one of the first Kickstarters where I didn't have Keith Garvey doing a cover for me. So I hired an artist who I really like. I hired Marissa Pope to do a cover for me, but it did not perform as well as I would have expected, given her name recognition and all of that. I mean, I have people in shows come up to me when they see her print hanging on my wall and they like recognize her work and they're like, I sell a lot of her prints to her fans and stuff like that that are like, oh yeah, give me that, you know. It's like, oh, is that Marissa Pope? And it's like, yeah, yeah. And then they'll buy the print. But the Kickstarter, that cover didn't perform. What ended up performing was Whiskey Paint's version of my teacher, um, which has also been turned out to be one of the more popular prints, even in regards to my Keith Garvey, Keith Garvey from Spirit of the Dragon 1 print is really the one that kind of blew up because that Kickstarter, I almost doubled my backer count, I think, on that one from my very first Kickstarter. And it was largely because of that cover. And as a limited edition 100 print run, I sold 88 of them in that one Kickstarter. And
let's actually talk about this because this is really interesting. And so I'm a strong believer, and obviously I sell comic books on eBay. And what I like to do is I want to buy merch that works well with each other. And I love buying limited print runs, and I love buying things like that. And also I understand that, and I don't know if it's the same on Kickstarter, but sometimes a cover doesn't work on Kickstarter, but I would imagine it could work in another setting or it could work on another Kickstarter. So it could work on issue 4 if you did a book for issue 3, but also variants are very complicated because just because you go out and hire a top artist doesn't mean it's going to work. And conversely, you could hire, I don't want to say a shitty artist, but you could hire an artist that is less well known and that thing could take off like a rocket. And so what is this like for you? Because obviously you just outlined the whole Keith Garvey, Marissa Pope thing that you ran into on your campaign. And I would imagine that you're great that something else is doing great on that campaign, but you're like, I thought the Mercer Pope thing was going to work. And then you outlaid money and it could be very stressful, I would imagine.
yeah, I mean, especially with It's tricky finding a balance between something that is consistently reliably that will reliably perform that that'll perform reliably well. Um, One artist who I've had a great amount of success with, she goes by the name Emerald Weapon, and I've been using her a lot more recently. And the reason why I like her, yes, that's this one. Um, she is very affordable and she sells really, really well. And she strikes that balance between affordability and performance, return on investment. So I know that I can pay $250 for a cover for her, and I'll make twice that on sales of her book just during my 3-week Kickstarter.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting because I think this is something that people forget, that running a Kickstarter is running a business,
Oh
and
yeah.
you have to know your numbers. I know my base cost on my books that I buy from my eBay store, and I know exactly when somebody makes me an offer on eBay, and I'm not saying eBay and Kickstarter are the same, but they're same in certain aspects. But you have to know what you can afford, what you can't afford, and how long something is going to take to recoup. And I think that that's a real skill. I really think it's a real skill to know that, hey, if I pick up this artist, I know I'm going to do all right and I'm not going to be broke. And it's so
I don't know
complicated.
if it's skill or just trial and error, because really for me, it's been largely trial and error. I mean, in Spirit of the Dragon issue 1, I paid $900 for an RB White cover that literally crashed and burned. And I kind of expected with his name recognition that it would do better. Marissa Pope, her cover after it's colored and everything runs about 600. Now I will make back my money on Marissa Pope eventually. Um, I actually have, and it's not going to be a super secret, but I actually had some books sent off to be signed and graded by her. So I'm looking forward to getting those back. I think they're going to do well for me as well. Um, but as I said, like it is kind of a trial and error, and I never expected Emerald Weapon to turn out to be as good as she was, but my backers seem to really like her. Um, and I'm like, I want to give my customers what they want, and if they tell me and if they consistently buy a particular artist and the artist is available, I'm going to keep working with them. That's one of the problems with Keith Garvey. He's just gotten so busy lately that when I started out, I was fortunate that I was like having him do, a cover. So I do 3 Kickstarters a year, and he had a cover in my first 5 Kickstarters. So, I mean, I was able to get 2 to 3 covers from him a year. Now I'm lucky if I can get one.
So let me ask you about that, because I think I was Keith Garvey's first interview, and I've been meaning to circle back, but he's just a busy man.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
He's great. He's the
I, I
nicest.
would I would love to have a Keith Garvey in every single one of my Kickstarters. I would probably be making 20% higher than I do right now. I've even had one of my backers tell me that, it's like, next time you have a Keith Garvey, let me know. And
So
it's
so
like,
so
oh, thanks, buddy.
let's actually talk about this, because I have mixed feelings on this. Where I think it's good to sit people on your bench, right? I view perhaps variance as a sports team, where sometimes it's good to sit out Keith Garvey for a Kickstarter. And I understand that if your sales are up 20%, it's hard to do that. But every once in a while, it's like, cool, we're going to bring in a fresh new crop of kids. And cool, now it becomes an oddity. And I mean, and maybe it's good to mix up artists every once in a while, but at the same time, if your customers say, look, I just want Keith Garvey and I love Keith Garvey and I'm coming here because I like your book, but I'm a Keith Garvey collector. I'm a Sun Kumanaki collector. I'm an Ebas collector, and that's where I feel that this gets tricky. And I'm curious what you think, because I know people who don't read anything on Kickstarter, but all they do is collect an artist. And so if
Right.
Keith Garvey's on a campaign, don't give a damn about the campaign. No offense to your book, but I just want the Keith Garvey. Or Whiskey Paint might be the same way to some degree, where I like Whiskey Paint. So I might back somebody's book because Whiskey Paint's on that book, and then I might read the book later on, but you got me in the door. And so
Right.
in my opinion, it creates a very complicated position, because when you don't have Keith Garvey, then that person's saying, maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't. And now you're in what I think is called a variant trap. And I think it's a problem. But I also think it's a good thing sometimes too.
Well, I need to make my expenses. And if Keith Garvey funds my campaign, like you were mentioning about, working with new artists, I have no trouble working with new artists. Try to, um, sometimes I'll go seeking new artists, or if I see somebody post a cover that I like, I'll reach out to them. Um, in my last, trying to think which.
Let me ask a question, because and I'm curious, is it that if you find a new artist that you really love and you have 4 covers, would you consider doing a 5th cover with that new artist if you had also Keith Garvey? So if Keith Garvey is not on your campaign, but or if he is on your campaign, would you consider adding a cover also versus subtracting? Because I get the whole expense thing where Keith Garvey allows you to fund and make money. And if you bring in a new artist, you could potentially run the risk of not funding or having a leaner budget and having a leaner campaign to some degree. And
Right.
so that's the whole, I think, thing. For me, I don't think your issue is working with new talent and saying I just need to make $3,000 over my budget to really make my book happen. Because that's the dilemma everybody has on Kickstarter, from my understanding.
Yeah. So my art budget per page is about $150. So for a 28-page book at $150 a page, we're talking $4,200. So that means I need to make that back plus all of my printing and everything else. So, but to your point, actually, there is a book, and this will be coming up for my next Kickstarter, which will be Angel of Darkness 5. Um, exactly to your point, had I have an upcoming Keith Garvey cover for Angel of Darkness 5. And when I was planning Angel of Darkness 4, um, I had a cover from a new artist, and I basically decided to move that cover to Angel of Darkness 5 for that very reason, because I'm not sure how well that cover will perform, but I know I'll have Garvey, so that will make up for it. And then basically I hired Emerald Weapon to do a cover for Angel of Darkness 4, which ended up being more popular than even the Whiskey Paint in that campaign that I had, which I was a little surprised at.
Yeah, see, this is so interesting. In which that, I mean, I just buy people's books and then I sell them on eBay, and I have a great time with it. So and I know who's great, who's not great. Obviously, I test the Kickstarter waters, in certain ways, but I can imagine that it must be really cool for you too, though, that when you find somebody whose book is outperforming everybody else's. I mean, that's wild, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean it's great, especially when you know it's about it's really comes down to the ROI. I wouldn't mind spending 7, 8, $900 on a variant cover if I know I'm going to be able to recoup that back during the Kickstarter. I can't spend $900 on a variant cover to make it back eventually on eBay. Like I needed to make it back during the 3-week Kickstarter because my eBay sales, I'm lucky if I make a couple $100 on eBay a month. So my eBay sales really aren't there. That's just kind of like pocket cash. So it needs to perform during the Kickstarter because that's where the eyes are on it. That's where the momentum is.
Yeah, no, this is interesting because obviously I play a long game in comics, and when I buy a book, my objective is to play a long game, and I might buy something knowing that it's going to be hot in 6 months from now. And so,
Right.
but my business is set up that it can handle debt. And I understand that I'm running a very different position because I'm not creating something, I'm just reselling something. And I have a lot of different merch across a lot of different things. So I'm very diverse in what when I move on eBay. And also I sell baseball cards and sports memorabilia. So obviously those two things balance each other out in many ways. But I think it's really interesting because I think people don't necessarily even understand that you don't need to make a profit on Kickstarter, but you need to break even. I feel when you're running a book and creating a book and doing everything on Kickstarter, the first objective should be to break even on all your expenses, get your printing costs covered. And then you should worry about making money as a secondary outside of that. Obviously, everybody wants to make money. I mean, if your whole costs are 7 grand with printing and then you made 14,000, you're doing all right on Kickstarter. But at the same time, I would imagine that your first objective is to get everything covered.
Yes. And I have been fortunate that my Kickstarters, for the most part, break even.
I know it's fascinating because I know very little about this. I tried running a Kickstarter for this show. I did fund, but it was a disaster, and I got a lot of shit for it. And people hated that idea, but obviously, I have a very different perspective of running a Kickstarter and what that looks like after running one than doing it before. And I can imagine that must be very, very, very rewarding when you break even on a Kickstarter, taking a lot of risk and deploying a lot of capital ahead of time. Because that I mean, Kickstarters are risky, I feel, to some degree.
It is, and it's a risk that gets more troublesome, um, more risky when there's so many people out there that they want um, they want to make a quick buck, and maybe they have an idea for a comic, or they have, and it could be a good idea. So they run a Kickstarter and they make a bunch of money, and then they get this money to go and start their project, and then they realize this is hard, and now they have all this money, and yet they're not able to fulfill their campaign. And now all of those backers are like, well, why should I risk my funds with somebody else, um, with another new person, when that could be they could run into the same problem,
So
and
let's actually talk about that. Sorry for cutting you up, but obviously I've been burned on Kickstarter. I'm going to make an assumption, and feel free to tell me I'm wrong. But I'm sure you've been burned on Kickstarter too. I don't think anybody who's been doing this as a backer long enough hasn't had one bad experience on Kickstarter. And I can tell you that the first time I got burned, it was my first time actually using Kickstarter, and I didn't come back to Kickstarter for 18 months. And this was almost 5, 6 years ago. And then it took me a while to come back. It took me about 2 years to come back. And so I find that to be a real issue because right now I have about 4 or 5 projects that I've been somewhat burned on. And it definitely makes me stop, especially with new creators and even with old creators to some degree. It says, I feel as just a backer, I need to stop. And then when I'm interviewing people, I mean, as an interviewer, I look at people's track record now and I have to because I've interviewed people who screwed their backers, and it's very complicated. And then furthermore, there's a lot of projects out there that are really good, and there's a lot of things, and it is massively competitive. I feel right now, and I'm curious how you feel about both those things because I feel that the whole thing has shifted massively, and we are in no man's land to some degree.
Kickstarter is a very competitive space. Absolutely, especially in indie comics. There is a lot of that, and there are some people who can do really, really well with it. And but a lot of times those are the guys that they've been doing it for years and they've built up a reputation. Um, and yeah, and it does become tricky because even because like one campaign, and I was like, talk about being burned. I've also had to take a step back. Like I'm very, very selective now about Kickstarters that I back. Um, largely part of it's money. I mean, I just don't have as much disposable income as I'd used to. But a lot of it too is like there's one Kickstarter that I backed was for a trade paperback. He had released every issue prior to the trade paperback. Um, I got the PDF of the trade paperback, but the trade paperback never delivered. And you could go on the campaign page right now. It's been over for about a year, I think. Um, and yeah, it's radio silence. And a lot of other people are in the same boat. It's like, hey, I got the PDF. Where's the book? So and like you said, even somebody that's fulfilled previous campaigns, they can still all of a sudden just drop off the face of the planet.
I mean, one of my biggest pet peeves is that, and I haven't heard any creator ever say this, where obviously people and books get late all the time. I'm right now, something was supposed to be delivered to me from somebody in September. We are probably looking at April or May. So talking 8 months late, give or take. And my question is, and I asked this person once, I said, why is it late? And my question is that, do you find that acceptable? I'm not saying you're a bad person, but I think if your book is late by 3 months, I consider that to be late and I find it to be unacceptable. I mean, if I walk into any other sector, if I show up to my job 30 minutes late, my boss is going to be like, why are you late? It's unacceptable, let alone, and I understand that things happen in comics, and I'm not trying, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but the first words that should come out of every creator, if they're more than 3 months late, is that this is unacceptable. I apologize. Because it is unacceptable, in my opinion, if you're 3 months late when you're supposed to deliver your book to me. I mean, that doesn't mean that you should have to refund me my money. That just means that those words need to come out. And I think it's a big problem in comics is that I think there's a lack of responsibility to some degree right now in the industry. But I digress. I mean, I don't know how you feel because I think you deliver relatively on time from what I've seen on your campaigns and the comments. And I think it is an art and an understanding that if I give you my money, you have a responsibility to deliver the product to me within a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, my goal is to fulfill my Kickstarters in 90 days or less. Uh, Realistically, it's closer to 60 days, but 90 days is the window I give myself. I feel like um, that is a reasonable time frame, at least for me. I pay because again, I pay for the artwork out of pocket. My book is literally ready to go to print, and the only thing I need to know is how many books to print. That's it, and that's what I'm waiting for.
That actually makes a lot of sense. That's how it should be done.
Now,
But I understand that not everybody can do that.
no, not everybody can, and I know that that's. And then there's some people that'll go out and they'll be like, "Oh, that's not what crowdfunding is supposed to be about." And it's like, yeah, but to me, like if I want to build a reputation, my business model, my reputation is based on, quick fulfillment, especially if I want to do multiple campaigns a year. I can't take somebody's money. Now, technically, and I don't know how some people do it, um, but technically, you're not supposed to. launch a campaign before the next one's fulfilled. And Kickstarter's not supposed to approve campaigns before a previous campaign is fulfilled. But I have backed campaigns where the it's not even over. Well, it's over. Like the campaign ends and they're immediately shilling their next Kickstarter. It's like I haven't even gotten the books from the one I backed, and you want
Let's
me?
just name who they are. There's 6 of them. There's 6 of them. We all know the 6, and there's nothing wrong with the 2 of them. Is Pat Shan runs a lot, and Merc Mag runs a lot in this fashion. And I'm not saying anything good or bad. They just do that practice. And then there's
Yeah.
other people who also do that
Now,
practice too.
and I know that, and these people, um, they'll fulfill eventually. So I understand that they have a business. I just look at it and I'm just like, that's technically against Kickstarter rules, because Kickstarter rules, like, I'm working on my next Kickstarter, setting up my page already before Spear of the Dragon is fulfilled. And once I accidentally clicked submit for approval before I was actually ready to, and they came back to me and said, "Nope, you got to fulfill your other campaign first." And I'm like, if I'm being told that to Kickstarter, I don't understand how these other people are able to
I could
submit.
answer
I
your
mean,
question.
unless they have multiple. That's the only thing I can figure, is that they must have multiple.
It's
Uh,
one of 2 things. It's one of 2 things. It's either they have multiple accounts and 2 separate business accounts, or they're bringing in so much money for Kickstarter that Kickstarter has basically said it's pay to play. It's one of those 2 things, because if
that's very possible, because yes, we are talking about campaigns that make 20 to 30 plus $1,000, like way bigger than I think the one was like a 60 or 70,000. I forget. It was crazy. Um
Pat Chan did what, Steamy or Cheeky, and that thing did 100,000. Merc Mag does 50 to 70,000 sometimes. So if Kickstarter's getting 10% at 50,000, they're like, go right ahead. We trust you, and if we're gonna make 7 grand off you every time you want to run one of these, guys, just run one every week. And after it gets Kickstarter, and obviously those places have big operations, and I do agree that they will fulfill. And this is not
yeah.
shitting on them at all, but it definitely raises a question: is that if because the question it raises is that if I did $1 million every time I did a campaign, how much of the rules would Kickstarter allow me to bend? And that's dangerous when you start entering companies that bend rules in that fashion, because that's when things go off the rails, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm not a particular fan of the.
how far the dollar decides how
Yeah.
far you want to go.
Yeah, and I wasn't referring to. I don't. I know who Pat Shand is. I don't know who the other creators you mentioned, and I wasn't referring to them specifically. I don't think I've ever backed anything by Pat Shand before. I do keep an eye on some of his Kickstarters, because when I first, he was actually kind of, I wouldn't say an inspiration, but like, um, one of his campaigns kind of, how do I put this? Okay, so his campaign kind of changed how I approach Kickstarters, because you've seen Preston's books, and his books are gorgeous, and he spends top tier dollars to get top tier artwork, and it looks like, I mean, you can tell what he's putting into it. And then, and no offense to Mr. Shand, you look at Pat Shand's books and they're okay. So like, if you were to look page for page, compare one of Preston's books to one of Pat Shand's books, and then you look at how much one of Preston's Kickstarters does and one of Pat Shand's Kickstarters does, there's you'd have to be like, what in the Twilight Zone is going on here? And one of the things that I recognize, which is also why I've kind of changed how I approach Kickstarter was largely um, for backer counts. And that's where I feel like that's where the key is for a successful Kickstarter. It's not really the covers. The covers are great. It's not really the interior artwork, which should at least be decent. Because if your artwork's totally shit, then you're gonna have problems. Um, and that's why I'm saying like Pat Shan's artwork isn't bad. It's decent. Um, but what he has is backer counts. He's got what, 700 backers every campaign, and that takes time. You have to build up to that. Um,
You have to build up and you have to pump a lot in. You have to
right.
pump a lot in, you have to build up, but also Pat Shand is a complicated position to some degree too, where we can't discount that Pat Shand did some work for Marvel and wrote a Marvel novel and some stuff there. Pat Shand has done some stuff in Hollywood. Pat Shand has built a reputation in Zenescope. So Pat Shand didn't come to Kickstarter raw. He came to
Right.
Kickstarter from the mainstream, which meant that he had a following, and he also did some stuff outside of Zenoscope, but he still put in a lot of work.
Oh
But he
yeah,
also,
I don't discount any of his success or his work. Um, and of course, I'm an outsider of this, coming into it with nothing. I'm like, I've been working in accounting for the last 20 years. Like, what do I know about any of this stuff? But and no, as I said, I don't discount them. I just recognize that when I look at campaigns that are successful, that make the kind of money that I want to make on Kickstarter, that's where I kind of look at, okay, what is he doing and how can I do that? One of the things that I've basically done is my stretch goals are now based on backer count rather than on how much money they are. And that was one of the major things that I changed in how I approach Kickstarters, because I was looking at the dollars, and really I felt like, no, I need to focus on the backers. Because and here's actually a good example. Like, I love my big backers. I love them until the end of time. But when one $400-500 backer cancels, that hurts a lot more than two or three $20 backers cancel.
no, I
So I
agree.
need to court those $20 backers hard and get more of those.
do,
And I
do,
feel
do,
like,
do, so to go off of that, do you also feel that it's easy, don't you want to get somebody in for $20 for the first time and then have them return and then basically have them maybe the next time spend $30 with you? Because to me, and this is just my business, and this is what happens sometimes in my eBay business, is I have a buyer who buys an item for $50 and then they come back, and that buyer now buys 10 to 20 items from me in a year. So they might just have spent a grand because they had such a positive experience, but they're only buying a $40 or $50 item each time. But the value of that buyer, or in Kickstarter's case, that backer, is worth a lot more. If you're running 3 campaigns and they come back to each of them and they came in at $20 and then they go to 25, 30, all of a sudden that backer could get up to being a $60 backer every
oh,
single time.
absolutely.
And that to me could be worth way more than a $500 one-time backer, or because the growth of that backer and the value of that backer is increasing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, like, for example, I have, so people that like this whiskey paint, my whiskey paint spanking cover. I have multiple tiers priced at different price points for that. One of the tiers, you get the book with a metal cover, and you get the book, a metal trading card of it, and that's bundled together. I think it's like $80 for that tier. And people that like this cover and they want the collectibles that go along with it will back that tier, and then they may not come back because they just like that cover. But yes, like you're saying, trying to build the middle while still providing the value for those high end backers that are willing to spend the extra money. Um, it's why I offer bonus stretch goals for my higher backers as kind of an extra thank you. They'll get something extra special for backing at that higher dollar amount. But it's still that middle ground, which is like the 25 to, we'll say 25 to $100 range, that I really want to try to focus on building.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. Obviously, in my eBay business, and I just equate it back to this, is that I have a medium uh, average buyer price. That doesn't mean it doesn't change or it doesn't go. And I'm trying to aim at a certain price point and a certain demographic where I have a specific income bracket that I'm targeting. And I know it sounds weird, but I'm looking for somebody who's making about 80 to 100,000 a year, either in a household or in their job. And maybe 70,000, we can make an argument, but somebody who is sort of upper middle class is my average consumer. And I think that it's very interesting because I don't think $25 on Kickstarter as an average is that expensive. And obviously, I think that that's what people have to learn how to run in business, is that who is your average customer? What do they look like? What do they do? What is their income? What is their job? How much money do they make? I mean, all of these questions don't get asked on Kickstarter because I think once you have that, you can have a really good idea of how to sell your book to people. But that's what I think. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I don't know. I hadn't really quite thought of going into that much detail into the statistics of my backers. Um,
It's a pet peeve of mine. It's like a hobby for me. So maybe I'm a little wired differently than everybody else. I like that data, so that's just me. But I know my business really really well. Like I really enjoy looking at the year sales and the graph in my eBay business. Like it just intrigues me extensively. But I'm a little wired differently than everybody else.
nothing wrong with that.
But I do want to talk about this cover here, which I think is interesting, to say
That
the
that
least.
that that is the main cover actually for Spirit of the Dragon. It is the main retail cover that's done by my interior guys. I like to have my interior guys do the main cover. Um, I feel like it's a nice way for them to show off, and I think they really knocked it out of the park with that one.
And then you did something by somebody who I like a lot too, and Joe Pecker, I believe, is how it's said. And then there's this one, and it is the flag there, and that, or was that there for Kickstarter reasons? Because I was a little confused because both of if that is there on the cover, it's awesome, and if it's not there, it's awesome too.
That is there on the cover.
Oh, that's a cool cover because I didn't know, because sometimes people get really creative on censoring images on Kickstarter. So I was a little confused, but
If
what
if
is
I
this?
ce- if I censor something, I try to make it obvious so that you know what you're getting.
Fair enough, but what is this like? Because obviously Joe Pecker does a lot of great works. He does a lot of fun stuff. I've read the name of his book. He just funded what, like 3 months ago, I think.
Yeah, the Brandy Bear campaign. That was how I found him, and I fell in love with his artwork, and I was like, I needed to hire him to do a cover. So I had this idea that I wanted to do. Pride covers seem to do well on Kickstarter, and I was like, well, I'll hire him to do a Pride cover, and I'll give it a shot and see how it goes. And again, talking about things that never actually happened in the book, those two characters never actually get shipped in the book. It was just something that I put together because I was like, hey, let's give this a try.
And then even to go in there, and then after this, I'll let you get out of here, but I'll give you a chance to promote yourself. What is that like also to have representation in comics? Because I think it's a real big issue right now where there's a way how to do representation correctly. Obviously, I interviewed somebody who is from the LGBTQ community in wrestling. last week, and we were talking about this topic in wrestling. And what is that like? Because I think it is nice when you have a cover for everybody and everybody's affiliation, for lack of a better word. And I think it is cool. And I think comics have become more inclusive in a lot of ways. And I think it's fascinating. So I'm just curious on that, because when you throw a pride cover on your campaign, you're now extending your audience in a lot of ways. And I feel like it's a good thing.
Yeah, that was one. I guess that was also one of those um, ideas that I had based on feedback from conventions, because comic conventions have become much more inclusive lately, and in interactions with different people, um, the artwork that I typically sell tends to draw a very, very narrow uh, attention base. And not that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, who doesn't love beautiful women? So yes, the majority of my customers up until now have been largely cis males, which is fine. That's what I am. So, it works. Um, so yeah, this was kind of an experiment to kind of reach out. Um, I Again, I'm not really doing any, which is something I constantly get. I do get asked a lot, why don't I have any guys? And I'm like, well, because I don't have any guys in my stories, and that's really the truth. Because, but I have thought about that. Like, if I'm, how can I, uh, what can I do to try to expand and provide, um, just provide and grow my audience to other people. But at the same time, I also don't, how do you put it?
You're not doing it in a way, and maybe this will help, where I don't feel like you're just doing it to make a quick buck. There's purpose and there's reason behind, is the way I feel about that cover. And I don't know if that's how you feel, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't feel like you're shoving down an agenda down my throat, if that makes any sense. With that cover, I
Yeah,
thought it was just there. And that's what I like about it, because I've seen campaigns that shove down an agenda. And I think it's a real, not skill, but it's a real art to know how to put a pride cover in your Kickstarter, but be like, it's just here. If you want it, you could have it. If you don't, here's the sexy girl with a robot behind her that could kill you.
yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it. Um,
But yeah, I love the cover. I actually love this cover a lot. And I like this one a lot too. I think this one's actually the better of the two, to be honest. Um,
I agree, and based on the feedback, my sales numbers, this cover is dramatically outperforming the other one. So,
you should have just not even released this one. You should have just been like, we're going with this, guys. It would have been great.
honestly, it could have actually. Well, I don't
I'm
really.
teasing. I'm teasing you.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is the sales that I got for that other cover could have, if I didn't release it, could have went into the other one. If that makes any sense. When
Yes,
people have
yes.
a choice, sometimes they choose one versus the other. Whereas if they don't, then they just go with it. So yeah, the other numbers what may have been better, but I had it and just decided to run with it.
Well,
Let my customers decide what they want.
choice is good. Choice is good. But I know you got a hard exit, but before you have to exit out of here, I think you got 7 minutes or maybe 6 minutes. But I do want to give you a chance to promote yourself. So where could people find you, bother you, hit you up, check out what you're doing, back the campaign? I put the links in the description, up above, down below, to the side, however you're watching. And you could click on those links. But where could people find you and all that stuff?
Um, Probably the easiest thing to do would be my link tree. Um, all my Kickstarters, my socials are all on there. Linktree/JTL2. Um, but yeah, or check out the Kickstarter, Spirit of the Dragon 4. It's going to run until Monday, February 19th. All my variant covers, they're all virgin, limited edition, and numbered. So that I do individual serial numbers for each book.
Cool, cool. That's cool. And then obviously I've just been saying this, and I'm gonna keep saying it. You have to support indie. What that means is backing people's campaigns, checking out what they're doing, obviously supporting, sharing out their campaigns, following people on social media. If you miss a book on a Kickstarter, obviously sometimes you get it on the back end of a Kickstarter, or people have internet stores, which can also be very helpful to find books. Also, sometimes just emailing somebody or messaging somebody can be extraordinarily helpful too, to finding the books you want. And then if I didn't already say this, I'm gonna say it again, just because sometimes I forget what I say. Following people on social media, it's a really big deal right now, so go do it. And then as far as I'm concerned, everything that I got going on, I am Pop Anime Comics on Twitter/X, Pop Anime Comics on Instagram, Pop Anime Comics on Facebook, Pop Anime Comics on YouTube, Pop Anime Comics collectibles on eBay. So I carry a lot of interesting books, comic books, cards. This card may or may not be invisible to some. I have those in my store. But if you get this card and it's invisible, you know why. But yeah, so that's what I do. And obviously, following me on social media, subscribing, and checking out what I do is a really, really helpful thing. And I appreciate it. And that's everything that I got going on. And I'm going to give you the final word before you got to get out of here, because you got to do something cool, but you don't have to tell us what you're doing. So, but beyond that, you got to have the final word.
Just thanks for having me on. It was great to come on and chat about what's going on, and you know, yeah, if you guys are interested in some sexy comics, my I guess the quick way to say is that if you like stories about hot chicks and sexy outfits kicking ass, you're gonna like what I'm doing.
Well, I don't think I could have said that any better myself, everybody. And that is